Thank you everyone for joining us today. Welcome. My name is Chad Fothergill, and together with the Advisory Council for the Institute of Liturgical Studies and the staff at Valparaiso University, we're pleased to welcome you to today's spring seminar, part of a series on language and liturgy, and especially today's conversation, poetry, liturgy, and the writer's craft. For those of you who might be joining us at the Institute sort of for the first time or hearing about us for the first time, we've been gathering on the campus of Valparaiso University for about 70 years for study, presentations, workshops, worship, various forms of community building. And so you can find out more about the Institute at our website and Facebook page. Like many of you, we've had to adapt these months, and we are very thankful for our seminar leaders and participants who've been willing to join us in this new way. Today we have about at least 75 registrants, perhaps more, and some folks even joining from Finland and Switzerland. So big welcome to our international audience today. So we're very pleased to have you all here. Just note that today's seminar is kind of part presentation and then part conversation. And if you have a question at any time, you're welcome to drop it into the chat function or the Q&A function. And we've got some people monitoring both of those. So with that introduction, please let me welcome Dr. Travis Scholl, who's a member of the Advisory Council. Travis works at Concordia Seminary, St. Louis, where he serves as managing editor of theological publications and teaches courses in homiletics and writing. Travis.
Thank you, Chad, and welcome to everyone. The format today, as Chad said, is pretty simple. I will introduce our speaker and he will speak for a bit. And I have some questions to get a conversation going, and then we will open it up for Q&A. And I will be moderating that, and so please feel free to submit questions to the Q&A wall, and I will be keeping an eye on that. So without further ado then, if you know the name Christian Wiman, it is likely because you know of at least one of three things by which he is known. Christian Wiman is a poet, and if you know him as a poet, you have books like Every Ribbon Thing or Once in the West on your bookshelf. But Christian Wiman is also a writer of prose, and if you know him as an essayist, you will likely have books like My Bright Abyss or He Held Radical Light on your shelf. But Christian Wiman is also known as a foremost curator of contemporary American poetry. And if you know him as this, you likely either have held a subscription to Poetry Magazine or you have had the honor of being a student in his classroom. Christian was the editor of Poetry, a leading magazine of all things poetic, for 10 years. Which I suspect in editorial terms is more than a lifetime. Following his tenure at Poetry, he has been teaching religion and literature through the Institute of Sacred Music at Yale Divinity School as the Clement Mule Professor of Communication Arts. If, as some have suggested, Christian Wiman speaks into a deep spiritual hunger, unique to our time, the lines he writes to fill that hunger are, as I see it, the leanest meat without an ounce of fat on the bone. As I read them, his words are struck blue hot by the spark that can only come from wrestling face to face with suffering, and yet also red hot from the nameless mystery of fire that we only begin to come to terms with when we use words like faith, or grace, or God. I count it as one of the great regrets of my life that I graduated from Yale Divinity School a few years before Chris arrived there. But I count it a great honor to be able to listen to him now. My fellow human creatures, Christian Wiman.
Thanks so much, Travis. It's great to be here as we can. I wish I was there in person, but great to be back with Valpo. I was there years ago. If my internet connection gets a little jiggly, as it sometimes does, I will be back. It just sometimes, I've got everybody in the house off of our lines, so hopefully it'll stick with us. I'm going to talk a bit about some of these poems that have to do with what this conference focuses on and things I've been thinking about a lot in the last few years. And I wanted to start with one from an anthology that I did. Travis mentioned that I worked as an editor, and I didn't know that I was good at editing until I got the job. Didn't know I would like it until I got the job. It hadn't occurred to me to do it. And it's something that I've wanted to continue after leaving Poetry Magazine. And so I did one anthology about poems on joy. I've got another one coming out on poems on home, but I wanted to start with that one on joy. And I came to do that one because I read an article in the New York Review of Books by Zadie Smith some years ago. It's been a long time now, 12 or 13 years. And in that, she talked about how she had experienced, if she was asked, she was a great lover of pleasure. She loves pineapple popsicles. She loves to describe faces to her husband. That's a sort of a game that they play at the end of the day. She loves all manner of food and loves pleasure. But if asked whether she loved joy, and if asked whether she would like to have another experience of joy, she thought she might say no. And the essay goes on to track, I think it's 6, maybe 5 or 6 different isolated moments of joy in her life, which she says is all she'd had before she had a child, and talks about them. And the essay speculates on why it is that she might not want to experience joy again. I remember reading that and thinking, well, I know why it is. It's because, or at least I think I know, it's because joy asks something of you. And if you don't have anywhere to go with the joy on the other side of it, then all it can do is sort of indict the fireless life that you inhabit the rest of the time. And it can become a grave sadness, our moments of joy, if they're not integrated into our life at all. C.S. Lewis said famously that an experience of joy makes us homesick for a home that we weren't even aware that we had. And you can't will those things any more than you can will yourself to have faith, or that you can will a poem into existence. You can't do it. But what you can do is will yourself to be ready for them. You can maintain an air of preparedness, of readiness for it. One of my jobs when I was at Poetry was to give the Ruth Lilly Prize, and that's a big prize, $100,000 prize for lifetime achievement. And one year we gave it to Lucille Clifton, great African-American poet, Lucille Clifton. And it was a wonderful part of the job to be able to call people up and give them this lifetime achievement. But sometimes people had won a lot of prizes and they weren't all that excited. But Lucille was the only one who actually let out a loud whoop on the phone. And so I ended my introduction of the Joy Anthology with this poem by Lucille Clifton, and which I think is very much about being ready for joy. I'm going to show it to you, so I'll share this screen. Sorry. It's called Hagriding. I'm assuming everyone can see this. I can't see you, so.
Yes, it's up, Chris.
Okay, thanks. Why is what I ask myself. Maybe it is the African in me, still trying to get home after all these years. But when I wake to the heat of morning, galloping down the highway of my life, something hopeful rises in me, rises and runs me out into the road, and I lob my fierce thigh high over the rump of the day, and honey, I ride. That's a wonderful exclamation, wonderful poem about joy. Notice that something rises and runs her out into the road. So something comes from outside and seems to ride her, and then she needs to ride the joy on the other side of it. So it's a reciprocal response. Next poem is about prayer. Might be familiar to some of you, by Caroline Duffy, an English poet. I teach a course at Yale called Poetry for Ministry. I used to teach it with Maggie Dawn, who ran Marquand Chapel. I'm teaching it with Doniel McCrae, a homiletics professor, next year. And one of the some of the time that we spend on that course is about how you can use poetry as a means of prayer in your church life. So maybe a minister can help himself in personal prayer. Maybe it can be integrated into church services themselves, and the poem can actually serve as prayer. All the different ways. Maybe it can be part of a group, a reading group or something, and a means of prayer for that. I'm sure that you are all familiar with times when you were unable to pray. I certainly am, and I have found poetry a great help and consolation in those moments. This poem, in particular, I find to be a help in that way. It's even articulating one of those moments when the world seems to pray for us. If we are attentive enough, the world prays for us. The only thing you need to know here is the Midlands is a place in England, region in England, and this poem ends with that line: Rockall, Malin, Dogger, and Finisterre. The poem explains this, but I'll make it very clear. These are names in the shipping forecast in England, so that if you live on the coast anywhere, you might hear the shipping forecast at night, or maybe it's in the morning, and so these are place names that she's hearing over the radio. Prayer. Some days, although we cannot pray, a prayer utters itself. So a woman will lift her head from the sieve of her hands and stare at the minims sung by a tree, a sudden gift. Some nights, although we are faithless, the truth enters our hearts, that small, familiar pain. Then a man will stand stock still, hearing his youth in the distant Latin chanting of a train. Pray for us now. Grade 1 piano scales console the lodger looking out across a Midlands town. Thin dusk, and someone calls a child's name as though they named their loss. Darkness outside. Inside, the radio's prayer. Rockall, Malin, Dogger, Finisterre. This poem actually quotes liturgy there: pray for us now and at the hour of our death. Catholic liturgy, prayers to Mary. It's interesting. I find this poem absolutely beautiful, just stunningly beautiful. And the prayer seems to arise out of the earth itself, and it contains everything that makes art possible, makes memory possible. Someone calls a child's name as though they named their loss, or those piano scales. All of these elemental aspects of human experience emerging out of the earth when this person can't pray. The task in such moments is, in a way, stop trying. You have to let yourself attend to what's going on around you rather than continually forcing it. Get your will out of the way. Another job that I had at Poetry Magazine when I first got there was to introduce speakers on Poetry Day. And the first year that I got there, Poetry Day was a celebration. It had been a fundraiser, but then the magazine got very rich and didn't need that anymore. But they, the first year I was there, the speaker for Poetry Day was Mary Oliver. And So it was my task. I'd been there only a couple of weeks at this time, and it was my task to get Mary Oliver from the her hotel to the event, and then to introduce her and sort of shepherd her around that evening. And if you know anything about American poetry, Mary Oliver's died recently, but she's still the most well-known American poet in existence. Her books sell hundreds of thousands of copies, and very, very famous poet. But the interesting thing about her, she doesn't act like it. Some famous people are kind of lacquered with their fame. They have a nimbus of self around them, but Mary did not. And I showed up in the lobby of this fancy hotel downtown, and there she was in her hunting jacket. It looked like a hunting jacket, and hunting boots, and it looked like she'd cut her own hair, and she was desperate for a cigarette, which she got just from when we got outside. Her partner was then dying, which I did not know at the time. Molly was dying, and they'd been together for a long time, and many years. And so this was in the background of everything that was going on with Mary at the time. And so we were walking down to the downtown where the reading was, and on Michigan Avenue, and you're all close enough to Chicago, you all know what Michigan Avenue is like in the middle of the day. It's packed with people, and that's so, it was an ordinary day. And suddenly Mary stops, and she bends over and picks up what looks to be a piece of meat. And she straightens up and shows it to me. And the other woman who was there, who's now my wife, I have verification for this event. She shows it to us, and it was a half of a pigeon. And Mary started showing us where the hawk had hit the pigeon, and how it had severed it and probably dropped half of it and wasn't able to retrieve it here in this busy street. And I was getting nervous. It was my first event there. I was like, Mary, this is fascinating. This is amazing. And but we are standing in the street with a piece of meat. We got to get going. And there's 1,000 people waiting at this reading. And she said, oh, yeah, of course. Okay. And she put it in her pocket, the half of a pigeon. And so then we went on, and I gave the introduction. Mary gave the reading. And the whole time she had that half of a pigeon in her pocket, a bloody half of a pigeon in her pocket. And I know she had it the whole time, because afterwards we went to this fancy apartment on Lakeshore Drive, one of those Mies van der Rohe buildings on Lakeshore Drive. And at a moment when she and I had taken refuge in a quiet spot in the kitchen, she pulled it out because she wanted to show me something else about this pigeon. So it was there. This is one of the poems that Mary read that evening, and it's a poem that I like quite a bit. And it's a poem that I teach in the hope that my students might be able to think about death in a different way, and think about their parishioners who are going through death. It's also used in the Poetry for Ministry class. White owl flies into and out of the field. Coming down out of the freezing sky with its depths of light, like an angel or a Buddha with wings, it was beautiful and accurate, striking the snow and whatever was there with a force that left the imprint of the tips of its wings 5 feet apart, and the grabbing thrust of its feet, and the indentation of what had been running through the white valleys of the snow. And then it rose gracefully and flew back to the frozen marshes to lurk there, like a little lighthouse in the blue shadows. So I thought, maybe death isn't darkness after all, but so much light wrapping itself around us as soft as feathers that we are instantly weary of looking and shut our eyes, not without amazement and let ourselves be carried as through the translucence of mica to the river that is without the least dapple or shadow, that is nothing but light, scalding aortal light, in which we are washed and washed out of our bones. It's a beautiful poem, and I think it's beautiful in large part because it doesn't evade the terror. This creature, which you'll notice is never named, could be you getting plucked up, is being eaten. I mean, this rapture is a terrifying end as well, and that's also part of this poem. Being washed and washed out of your bones is also an image of violence, and a natural image of violence. Okay. So maybe I should do one more, Travis.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay.
Just keep going, man.
Okay. Well, let me do I'll do one of my own poems. And then if we have time, we can come back to the others or whatever. I want to save some time to talk. This poem is from a book I wrote a while ago. Travis held it up, Every Ribbon Thing. It's also is about attention. I find that that when I grow away from God, it's as if God doesn't exist until I turn my attention toward him. And it's that act of attention that reactivates God. And there's something deeply mysteriously true about that. I think there are all kinds of things in our lives that aren't out there existing waiting for us to turn to them, that in fact they exist. They're verbs and rather than nouns, and they exist, that their existence is in relationship. It's activated by relationship. The eye with which I see God is the eye with which God sees me, is how 13th century theologian Meister Eckhart famously put it. The eye with which I see God is the eye with which God sees me. Heretical at the time, heretical now for some people, but I find it helpful. This poem, let me read the poem. When the Time's Toxins. This poem is about that. When the Time's toxins have seeped into every cell, and like a salted plot from which all rain, all green are gone, I and life are leached of meaning. Somehow a seed of belief sprouts the instant I acknowledge it. Little weedy, hardy, would-be greenness tugged upward by light, while deep within, roots like talons are taking hold again of this our only earth. It's interesting, I had that talons right next to Mary Oliver's poem. It was completely unintentional. Read something really interesting recently. I've been reading a good bit about it, about the communication of the natural world that we've been unaware of and are learning more and more about. In this instance, it's trees. And when you have a stand of trees, the roots communicate with each other. And if one is damaged in some way or threatened in some way, the others will actually send extra nutrients to it. They communicate about threats, like a blight or something. They somehow this communication is going on underground all the time. And I find that a beautiful thought, that to think that we need to unite. We need to be in relationship and united with one another, not in spite of the world around it, but because it's natural to the world, because we are part of that world. And our place demands that same kind of relationship, our health. Okay, why don't I pause there and talk to Travis some? I'll stop screen sharing. And if it comes up, I'll bring some of these poems in.
Yeah, this is fabulous. And if we want to come back to the poems, that'd be great. Boy, a lot of thoughts going through my head. I guess maybe a place to start, and I know you've written a lot, especially in your prose, about your own religious experience connected with your childhood and the sort of pilgrimage you've gone through. But that idea I wanted to pick up on when you were discussing Carol Duffy's poem, "The World Prays for Us," when often when we can't. And what occurred to me in the context of this institute is I wonder if there's a role that liturgy plays in that, and in the broadest sense, sort of liturgical movement in life. And, I'm thinking too about, traditionally, maybe this is a role that the Psalms play of reconnecting us to creation in some way that allows something outside of ourselves to pray for us when we can't pray. And so I guess maybe a question is there, except to say, I mean, do you find a connection between poetic language and liturgical movement or ritual that maybe plays that similar sort of role of prayer when we cannot pray?
Oh, I definitely do. That I mean, the repetition, the cadences, the sonic quality, the way that you're conscious but not quite conscious of a poem sometimes, and the ritual quality of it, I definitely do. I often find poetry more powerful than I do the specifically religious experiences in my life. And my experiences of experience of art often feel to me more powerful, and I feel guilty about that. I feel like they should be. It shouldn't be that way. And I'm thinking a lot these days about why that is, and trying to write my way into some kinds of answers. But I do think that God speaks to us all in a different way, and he speaks to me clearly through poetry, and I know a lot of people like that, but there are a lot of other ways that God speaks to people. I guess, does that answer your question? Does that?
Yeah, no, and actually it kind of leads me into another question I have, and that is, because I mean, I identify with that. I suspect not more than a few people who are listening identify with that power. And I guess, one of the things I'm always interested in is what is happening in poetic language that gives it that power. And I feel like I'm not just talking about, lyric poetry, but the poetic in any form or kind of language. I mean, is that something you've thought about? What's actually happening there? That something is happening in the language that I think is unique to poetry. I don't know if I've ever been able to describe or put into words what that power actually is, but something's going on there.
Yeah, I think it's an abstract power it's the same. It's in the Bible. I mean, so much of the Bible is poetry. But so much of the Bible is not poetry. But I find it's very similar to music. That the initial power of poetry is sort of deep, hydraulic, almost power of galvanizing at a very deep level, and that's what I find myself responding to. First of all, I am not aware often of the meaning of a poem until I've read it. But often I love a poem before I understand a poem, and I actually write poems of my own that I don't understand for a couple of years later or even further, but that I know are right. I know that they are finished, because the sound is there. And so I think that is something that exists at a deep unconscious level in poems. And the reason why it can, just like music, the reason why it can just touch us so deeply.
Yeah, and there's actually a couple comments that we have from some of our participants that are making that connection. It strikes me that, you know, you brought up sound. And I think in creative writing circles, you know, one of the catchphrases is always finding your voice, you know.
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting is in that context, that's often metaphorical, right? Finding the voice, and the way I can, you know, Frank Bedard, I've heard often talk about fastening the voice to the page, which feels metaphorical to me. But in music, and I think in liturgy too, that it's not metaphorical. There are actual voices speaking. There is sound that's actually happening. And it feels like that's a connection to,
Yeah.
you know, if we want to call it the poetic in language.
Yeah, no, I agree. I feel much more of the musical connection, not fastening to the page. That's not, I wouldn't go the way that Frank is going there. I would go actually, I hear it in the air. It's actually, it's in the air, not necessarily on the page. It's, you want to carve a sound that is in the air and everyone can hear. But he's a very different kind of writer. I mean, he's almost eliminating music from his poems. I mean, that's almost a strategy.
Right. Actually, I think this connects. We have a question from Noel that I'm just going to read. I think it's an interesting way where we can go from here. So she writes, as an artist and an academic, forms of expression function as mediums for our experiences. For me, an experience can involve overwhelming moving parts and emotions. It can paralyze the transferring of experience to expression through a form. Do you find this happening to yourself, and how does the experience eventually find the connection with the form?
No, I don't find it happening. The experiences that overwhelm me, I find that they don't translate into art usually. Maybe there aren't many of them in my life that are like that, but I find the forms of art are like those gloves that let you handle radioactive material, that that there's something, they chill the experience. Or Kay Ryan talks about an experience has to go through what she calls a chillifier before it's able to become art. And T.S. Eliot has a famous phrase, the objective to relative. You find something outside of your emotion that enables you to treat the emotion, to displace it in some way. So I've always found this directly connects with the sound, the element of sound, because what I am attending to when I'm making a poem is the way it sounds. It really is. Eliot again says it's like quasi-musical kind of composition. I'm attending to the sound, and the rest of it is in the background. And so sometimes I'll write something that really, really surprises me because I'm paying attention to the sound. In fact, I could show you a poem at some point if we get to it.
Yeah, well, and what you made me think of, and then maybe we can go to that poem, is I'm always drawn. It's a little quaint, but I've always been drawn to Robert Frost's image of sentence sounds. Mm-hmm. That it's the sound of the language you hear if you were hearing a conversation behind a closed door and you're in the other room. Yeah. And you would hear, so even though the language itself isn't intelligible, you hear the sound of the conversation, and that sound is sort of the rhythm of the words coming through the wall. And, that always feels like poetry. Yeah. What's that?
We have a sound coming through your wall right now.
Oh, right. Yeah. So the boys are upstairs, but it's vibrating through. It's a sound of joy, though. So
yeah.
So, well, would you want to go to that poem? That'd be great.
Let me show you this poem because it's a good example of what I'm talking about. Let me see. This poem is called "I Don't Want to Be a Spice Store." And it's a really good example of a poem where I was concentrating on something else and the sound of something, and then it veered in a way that shocked me and brought that feeling that the questioner was talking about. I didn't even really know that alarming feeling. I didn't know that's what I was getting at. I don't want to be a spice store. I don't want to carry handcrafted Marseille soap or Sampa and yak butter or 9,000 varieties of wine. Half the shops here don't open till noon, and even the bookstores brined in charm. I want to be the one store that's open all night and has nothing but necessities. Something to get a fire going and something to put one out. A place where things stay frozen and a place where they are sweet. I want to hold within myself the possibility of plugging one's ears and easing one's eyes. Superglue for ruptures that are, one would have thought, irreparable. A whole bevy of non-toxic solutions for everyday disasters. I want to wait brightly lit and with the patience I never had as a child for my father to find me open on Christmas morning in his last ditch lone wolf drive for gifts. Light of the world pin light, bobblehead compass, fuzzy dice. I want to hum just a little with my own emptiness at 4 a.m. To have little bells above my door. To have a door. So that's a good example of a poem that really took a swerve that I wasn't expecting at all.
Is there a place you locate in the poem where that swerve happened?
It really is when my father first, I want to wait brightly lit with the patience. I wrote that line and I was like, oh, whoa, what's going on here? And then wrote the rest of the poem, and it was a shock to me. And that really was my father. He was very indifferent to holidays, and his kids really quite indifferent to his kids. And he on Christmas morning he would go out and the only thing that was open was truck stops. So our presents would be like a fuzzy dice or a bobblehead compass. But Light of the World pin light is in there too, so that's pretty good.
Well, and I think that's what makes the poem so incarnational to me. I mean, you said Christmas morning in a theological frame of mind. I immediately incarnationally, the Christ wasn't born in the spice store, but in the truck stop.
Right.
And so that makes it the grit of the poem really adds to that, I think.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought of that. My daughter was looking at it one day, and she's 11 years old, and she said, I kind of do want to be a spice store. Which
different strokes for different folks, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, there's another question here that may connect in an interesting way. So a question about hymnody. And the Institute does a lot of work with church musicians. And so, we even, when we're in person, we have a hymn commission every year. And have you thought at all about the connection between hymnody and poetry? And, obviously, I think hymnody is a form of metered, poetry. And yet, oftentimes we can sit on a Sunday morning and the hymns aren't speaking to us, or they don't speak to me the way a poem that I'm reading out of, I'm reading Jane Kenyon for my Lenten discipline this year, or any of the poems you've shared. But what sort of relationship might there be there?
Yeah, I don't have much to say about that. We had a great hymnody professor, Thomas Troger, who I'm sure people probably know, who left Yale a couple of years ago. In fact, Danielle McCrae really took his place, but she doesn't write hymns. Yeah, I don't think about it that much. I know that with regard to Emily Dickinson, that so the hymn meter that's behind her voice. What I don't think about the connection between poetry and hymnody much at all, except with spirituals, and that's an interesting exception, and I'm very interested in those, and have been thinking about them recently because I was teaching Lucille Clifton, and Tracy K. Smith came into a class and read a poem called "Wade in the Water," and so we looked at the history of that, and I feel a real connection between the spirituals and poetry a lot, because there's such a sense of urgency to them. And and there were, like that poem "Wade in the Water" was, Harriet Tubman would use that to, when they were helping escaped slaves, they would sing that song, and it meant actually go into the water so the dogs don't get you. Dogs can't smell where you've gone. And a lot of those spirituals arose for very practical reasons and desperate reasons. And for that reason, it should be sung in white churches with very carefully, and then the context has to be given, and it's a fraught enterprise. But I do feel a real connection in those and poetry. There probably is more of a connection in hymnody, but I'm just not aware of it. I just haven't thought about it.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things, you talked about, I'm always struck by the way Dickinson, we know she had a collection of Isaac Watts's poems in the home that she consulted often, and the way she will take those sort of hymn meters and just twist them, and do these amazing things with them that in one sense makes them unsingable, but in another way does something poetically that the hymn couldn't have done.
Yeah, it's very yeah.
And the spirituals, well, obviously, ironically, that connects the virtual webinar we had before yours was Luke Powery talking about the power of the spirituals. Yeah. And it reminds me too, I did a lot of work with James Weldon Johnson, and his collection of the spirituals was the first collection that was edited and anthologized by an African-American. And when I was looking at his manuscripts for that, down the street from the Divinity School at the Beinecke, that same week, the Abyssinian Baptist Church Choir from Harlem sang on campus, and they sang "Wade in the Water." Oh, wow. And it brought the house down. I mean, it was electric. They knew what they were doing. They sang it right before the intermission. And I mean, it was just amazing. Then they walked off, and everybody's just sort of buzzing with "God's gonna trouble the water." So I think there's a power there that and they rise out of oral tradition as well, right? So this speaking and singing, I don't even know how to put it into words, but there's something there.
Yeah, it's a very powerful connection with poetry. But I agree, I've been incredibly moved listening to what we're doing is background for a lot of the poems that we're reading. Right.
There's another question here that I think is interesting. Brantley picks up on. He asks if you would be willing to expound on the guilty feeling you have for resonating more with poetry than other forms of liturgy or ritual. And he says your line, "The failure of religious feeling is a form of love," comes to mind. And if you could maybe comment on that, or does that challenge you in some way in terms of your own faith?
Yeah, I feel like I feel it's a failure on my part. I say that, but I have tried so hard to so many different churches. I crave communal experience, religious experience, and I crave a spiritual experience in a church with a group of other Christians. What I often find in communal religious experience is that I'm sitting there fighting for my faith, that I'm actually not having it reinforced. I'm fighting for it. I'm fighting for a place in it. I'm thinking, how am I part of this? I'm not. I don't believe what I'm hearing. I feel displaced from it. And Marilyn Robinson has a beautiful essay called Psalm 8, in which she talks about why it is that she's driven to go to this little Presbyterian church every Sunday. And when she's a kind of mystic, she describes her mystical experience. And for her, it's clearly, it's some kind of stabilizing thing. She's never bored. She's never feels resentful. And I feel all those things like a child, and I wish I didn't. But that's all. It's that simple. I mean, when I was a kid, the two most boring things in my life were church and school, and I just couldn't stand them. I got out of school as early as I could. You know, I barely finished an undergraduate degree, and church just drove me crazy. And I have ended up in church school. I mean, it's hilarious, really. It's like God's great sense of irony.
Yeah.
But it is, in all honesty, I crave an experience that I find I'm unable to have.
Yeah, I just have to ask, how do you manage that as a teacher in the classroom? Or is that something you feel you grew out of in terms of the experience of school as a child? You know, to now be a professor and be in the classroom, is that a challenge or a tension there?
It's a challenge. Yeah, it is. I mean, I think I'm honest about it with my students. I try to teach different sorts of classes that I myself would be able to enjoy. But it's a challenge. I don't think poetry necessarily belongs in classrooms. And it's a peculiarity of American life that it's been relegated to that. I lived in Prague years ago, and after the Velvet Revolution, and I met several people who had these secret shelves for their poetry. They weren't allowed to have these poets, but they had these secret places where they kept them. And I did an event with Carolyn Forche last week or week before, whenever it was, and I know you were there, and she just wrote a book, wonderful memoir, in which she talks about how important poetry was to the people of El Salvador when she was down there, and how these guerrillas in the forest, you know, getting ready to, the resistance fighters would be able to quote their poets, and if they heard that she was a poet, they would want her to quote a poem. And so I think it's very specific to American culture and not a healthy development, but it's what we've got. And so I do feel a responsibility to get poetry into the lives of these students, and like I'm doing. I don't feel cynical about it at all. I feel like it's like this course, Poetry for Ministry, or these are things that are really helping, I think, because I hear from people when they've gone off into their ministerial lives, and they tell me how they've used certain poems in certain situations, which is what matters to me, how poetry exists in the world.
Well, and I'm thinking that sort of takes me back to the spirituals a little bit, in terms of, sites in the world where poetry is happening that aren't in the classroom.
Yeah.
And I think I do feel the same in my own sort of religious experience. I do feel a similar experience with some of the kind of classic American folk hymns. My song is Love Unknown, does it to me every single time. Or, I know in my own tradition, the setting of Psalm 23, the King of Love, my shepherd is often sung at funerals, and it just sort of gets you.
Mm-hmm.
And those are places where something poetic is happening that isn't a place where it's being studied and dissected.
Yeah. Well, that's another thing. I emphasize memorization in my classes. So everyone has to memorize various poems, not the same, they get to choose what they are, but they memorize and recite them. And so there's a lot of, I don't spend a lot of time dissecting poems, I guess.
I guess, since you brought up Carolyn Forche, is there an aspect in all of this conversation of that idea of witness that, which I don't think we often associate with poetry, except that Carolyn Forche keeps reminding us that poetry is witness, and other poets and writers like her. And I wonder if that's something you've thought about. I feel in your writing, you've something in the background is your experience of suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And is that maybe a connection there too with this aspect of witness?
Not consciously. I never, I do find Carolyn's, I find her a very compelling and helpful thinker and just presence. But and one thing she said when we were talking was, she's written about this before, but she said it very beautifully when we were talking, was that her notion of witness, and this goes to what you were saying, that the poem is not a record of an experience. It's actually inscribed with the experience. I mean, the experience is inscripted into the poem itself. So you might read a poetry of witness that doesn't mention the event that it's witnessing. That is, the experience might pass in a different way. And that really resonated with me, and resonates with me in terms of what you said, because there was a while there when everything I wrote seemed to have a burn mark on it, from what I'd gone through. And even when it was a poem of joy or whatever, it had a burn scar on it. And that seems to me very much a kind of witnessing that I was being forced to do.
Yeah, I even think your line from the poem you read, when time's toxins have seeped into every cell.
Right. Yeah.
Which within the context of the poem is metaphorical language, but I mean, you've experienced literally toxins in your cells just through your cancer experience.
Oh yeah, that poem was written in the hospital too. I mean, that's the perfect example. I didn't think of that, but that's the perfect example. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. So there is a question here. I think it might be a little bit of a stretch, but I think we can go there. And that is a question about craft. And so the question is, how does an understanding of poetry shape liturgy, such as crafting liturgies or other responsive texts? And then even, and I'm thinking you teach a course on poetry and worship, the connection to preaching. And so on the level of craft, how have you thought about, or even maybe, obviously teaching students, many of whom are going to be going into ministries that do worship. Mm-hmm. What do you think is going on there that can help ministers, church musicians, preachers, that poetry enables us to do?
Yeah, well, if we had time, I could, go through some things very directly. But I once gave a weekend conference to a group of Baptist ministers in Texas who wanted to get poetry more into their churches. And I was very surprised to be asked, very surprised that there was such a group, and delighted with the results. But this is the thing, we spent the whole weekend talking about things like this, but it has to do with things we've talked about: sound, cadence, silences, all of those things that you learn to put in there. And it also I think has to do with a line between obscurity and clarity. And people think that, well, everything has to be clear, and in a way it does, but there are certain obscurities that can be very provocatively mysterious. I mean, the Bible is filled with them, and poetry is very good at teaching you which is which. The obscurities that are BS, and there are laziness or on the part of the poet or whatever, and the obscurities that are into which a kind of grace can move, so that you understand without understanding, or you comprehend. I find poetry very useful in all of those, in thinking about all of those, and think it could be great in thinking about liturgy in the same way.
Are there any particular poets that you think help us, by reading them, help us be able to make that distinction, to help us see those sort of pregnant silences?
Well, I love Yehuda Amichai. Let me just go ahead and show you this one poem. I'll show you. This is a very short one here, The Place Where We Are Right. So he was raised Orthodox Jewish, but left it all because he said he didn't have any crisis of faith or anything. He just was too bored. It's pretty much articulating what I've articulated. He was just too bored by it. But his poems are filled with liturgical language, scriptural reference. He was obsessed with it. From the place where we are right, flowers will never grow in the spring. The place where we are right is hard and trampled like a yard, but doubts and loves dig up the world like a mole, a plow, and a whisper will be heard in the place where the ruined house once stood. You could drop that right into a service, and use it. It is a poem of great modesty, but it's also a poem of assertion, because it's doubts and loves dig up the world, so that you need to proclaim what you love. This is the one I was really thinking of, though, from the book of Esther. From the book of Esther, I filtered the sediment of vulgar joy. And from the book of Jeremiah, the howl of pain in the guts. And from the Song of Songs, the endless search for love. And from Genesis, the dreams and Cain. And from Ecclesiastes, the despair. And from the book of Job. And with what was left, I pasted myself a new Bible. Now I live censored and pasted and limited and in peace. A woman asked me last night on the dark street how another woman was who'd already died before her time, and not in anyone else's time either. Out of a great weariness, I answered, "She's fine. She's fine." Now, I love that poem. And it seems to be saying, most obviously, that if you cut away the parts of the Bible that are disturbing, that you don't want to talk about, God's violent or whatever, people are degraded or whatever, pick whatever, then you've censored it. And obviously his peace here is a fake peace in a way, because he's denying the death of this woman at the end. She's fine. But what I really love is it's not simply the disturbing parts of the Bible, or the disturbing parts are not simply what we typically think of as disturbing, but it's Esther. It's the vulgar joy of Esther. It's the endless search for love in the Song of Songs. It's dreams. It's the very thing that makes Job. So what it is all of the extreme experience of the Bible, all the intense religious experience. And if you ask me one of the things that I find frustrating in church, it's that it does not acknowledge the intensity of my search and feeling for God. That I often feel overwhelmed by that, and a tremendous hunger. And then when I go to church, it seems I can't make a connection between those two things. And I think in a way that's what the Amichai poem is about. But he has a lot of poems that would work really well when you're studying scripture or liturgy.
Yeah, I have his collected poems on my shelf, and it's one of the books that's written up the most. I mean, I have the thing all marked up, so much great stuff in there. It reminds me too of I don't know if he was conscious of this, but so many of his poems work as midrash as well,
Yeah,
this sort of
yeah.
Jewish sense of, well, it goes back to what you're saying about the silences of dwelling in the silences of scripture and
Mhm.
finding something there. I
But
guess,
that's why, one quickly, that's one interesting thing. Like if you think of which poets, the poets that I find are the ones that are speaking into the silences, that they are the ones that were silenced. Not necessarily Amakai, but if you think of Clifton, she has some poems about biblical figures. Fanny Howe, Marilyn Robinson, not a poet, but her all those writers are rescuing some of the silences that have afflicted Christianity, I think, and I do find them incredibly helpful, and they seem to me very useful in terms of crafting new liturgies.
yeah, we could go a whole nother hour
Yeah.
just on that. So, but there was a couple questions, and I feel kind of obligated, and maybe this would be a place where we could land to end our time. A couple of people have asked about the pandemic, and one comment is about how the pandemic has brought about a hungering for an experience of God as the holy other. And so I guess, how has the pandemic changed, challenged, affirmed your connection or your relationship to poetry, reading and writing? And obviously it makes possibilities like what we're doing right now possible. But how has this year affected you poetically?
Well, I had one very good experience, and then I put together that home anthology. So that gave me focus, and I did that entirely during quarantine. Um, and and wrote the introduction and everything. So that was a good focus. On the other hand, I haven't written much poetry at all, and have felt crushed by quarantine, and crushed not simply crushed in the way that a lot of people have articulated. I feel like it's closed me off. Like it's made me not open to hearing things sometimes that I would ordinarily hear. And I'm coming out of it. It's better, but I'm quite aware of it, and I'm aware that my friends have articulated something very similar. And so I think it's a common phenomenon. I mean, I'm a solitary person, and generally quite happy to spend 12 hours alone in a room. But there's something about the enforced and relentless quality of this that has been really stifling. I do find poetry still a rescuing thing. I still read it every morning, and I'm delighted. I read, I mentioned this. Oh no, I didn't mention this, but there's a Brazilian poet, Adelia Prado, who is new to me, and she's been around she's famous in Brazil. And but I've just been reading her this year, and she's Catholic and is someone else who often finds an intensity of experience in poetry that's greater than what she experienced in her Catholicism. But she marries those two beautifully in her poems, and I found her to be a great comfort. In fact, those of you interested in liturgical strategies might look at some of her work too. She's really a compelling poet.
That's new to me, so I'm writing that one down. So, well, maybe this is a good place for us to unfortunately, and I was struck in one of your poems in Once in the West, an elegy, really. You have this couplet: there are eyes, there are hands, there are lives, so other lit. And I love that word, other lit. And I feel other lit today. So I want to thank you for that. And thank you so much for your time and your words and your grace towards us.